On the morning of October 13, 1899, the town of Selkirk, Montana awoke to a mystery so chilling that it would haunt generations to come. The Thornfield household, a grand three-story Victorian mansion that stood proudly on Maple Street, had gone silent in a way that was immediately unsettling. Inside, 7 beds lay perfectly made, their covers undisturbed, tucked in with the same precision as the night before. The house once alive with the laughter and footsteps of Gabriel Thornfield's 7 daughters felt hollow, like a family crypt rather than a home. Not a single window was broken, no doors had been left ajar. The chill of the morning frost clung stubbornly to the window panes, yet no footprints marked the ground outside, and the girls' nightgowns were still hung neatly at the foot of each bedas, though they had simply vanished into thin air. Margaret, 26, Catherine, 24, the 22-year-old twins Ella Laner and Elizabeth Sarah, 20. Grace, 17, and young Rebecca, just 14, gone without a trace, the local sheriff's report. Quietly sealed under federal order and kept hidden from the public for nearly 80 years, recorded one particularly disturbing detail: every bedroom had been methodically searched, not by vandals or looters, but by someone who knew the house well, someone familiar with the Thornfields' routines, their hiding places, their habits. Yet not a single item was missing. Jewelry remained in its boxes, money in its drawers. This wasn't theft, it was something far more sinister: the disappearance of the Thornfield sisters remains one of the most inexplicable cases in American history, but the truth buried deep in dusty archives and long-forgotten government files hints at a vast conspiracy involving corruption, greed, and a hidden network of human trafficking that reached far beyond the borders of Montana territory. Before we continue uncovering the dark truth behind this story, make sure you're subscribed and have hit the notification bell. These chilling tales of forgotten history deserve to be remembered, and drop a comment telling us which state you're listening from. We love hearing from mystery seekers around the world. The investigation that followed the girls' disappearance would go on to shake Selkirk to its core, revealing a darkness lurking beneath its polished surface. At the turn of the century, Selkirk was considered a gem of the frontier, nestled in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains. The town had grown rapidly from a rough-hewn mining outpost to a flourishing community of nearly 800 residents. Silver ore had brought wealth, and the newly completed Northern Pacific Railroad had brought culture, industry, and influence. By 1899, Selkirk buzzed with activity. Main Street bustled with freight wagons and businessmen, newcomers and families, all drawn by the promise of a better life. It was a town in transition, bridging the wild past with an imagined future of refinement. But just beneath the surface, the familiar tensions of the American West simmered: economic inequality, labor unrest, and the clash of old settlers with new money created a fragile social fabric, and for those willing to look closer, troubling patterns had begun to emerge. Young women, many of them recent arrivals, disappearing quietly, always with a vague letter home or a whispered farewell, never to be seen again. At the heart of Selkirk's social and economic life stood Gabriel Thornfield, a widowed father who had arrived in 1892 with a single wagon and 7 daughters. He had quickly become one of the town's most powerful figures after his wife died of pneumonia during the journey from Ohio. The townsfolk had rallied around Gabriel, moved by the sight of the determined man cooking over a campfire with his girls huddled close in the bitter Montana cold. By 1894, his modest dry goods store had grown into a regional empire. He secured exclusive contracts with mining companies, partnered with Chicago and San Francisco suppliers, and built the grandest home in 3 counties. The Thornfield sisters, raised with care and opportunity, had each flourished. Margaret, the eldest, was a gifted teacher who revolutionized Selkirk's one-room schoolhouse. Catherine, her artistic sister, had filled the town with beauty through her evocative landscape paintings. The identical twins Eleanor and Elizabeth ran a successful seamstress shop that became a social hub for local women. Sarah, with her angelic voice, organized the church choir and spearheaded countless charitable initiatives. Grace, mathematical prodigy, managed her father's books with uncanny precision, and young Rebecca, full of warmth and laughter, was a beloved fixture at the local library where she read to the children of exhausted miners. But as Gabriel's business empire grew, so too did suspicion. Whispers circulated about how a man who had arrived with nothing now hosted mysterious visitors from the east, arriving at night and leaving before dawn. These men, dressed in fine wool and carrying polished briefcases, were never seen in town during daylight. Their business, whatever it was, never appeared in the ledgers of Thornfield Co. The summer of 1899 had been especially tense. Labor disputes had begun to erupt in nearby towns as miners organized for better pay and safer conditions. The newly formed Western Federation of Miners stirred unrest, and rumors swirled about potential strikes and violence. Gabriel, as both employer and supplier to several mines, found himself under pressure from both workers and wealthy investors. The Depression of 1893 still cast a long shadow, and the delicate balance of Selkirk's prosperity seemed increasingly unstable. Then came October 12th. It began like any other autumn day, cool and bright, with maple leaves falling in golden showers along the town's cobbled streets. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary that evening. Townspeople reported seeing the Thornfield girls at various events. Margaret stayed late at the school helping a struggling student. Sarah was heard rehearsing a hymn at the church, and the twins had just finished fittings for a wedding gown. There was no indication of distress, no final goodbyes, and then silence. The next morning, as the frost settled on the town, Gabriel Thornfield stood on his front porch with a look that none would ever forget. Pale and hollow-eyed, he spoke only once to the sheriff before retreating into his home. The sheriff's initial report noted the strange calm inside the mansion: no broken locks, no overturned furniture, only the disturbing order of it all, the stillness of untouched rooms, the presence of the girls felt erased, too clean, too deliberate. For weeks search parties scoured the forests, creeks, and train lines. The Bitterroot Mountains were combed by volunteers and lawmen alike, but there was no sinew footprints, no scraps of clothing, no personal belongings. Scattered in haste, the Thornfield sisters had disappeared entirely, as though plucked from the earth by invisible hands. Theories abounded. Some said it was a kidnapping by outlaws, others whispered of a government cover-up, still others claimed something darker, more supernatural. But the most disturbing rumors centered on the railroad and the strange men Gabriel had hosted. Could the girls have been taken east, sold, hidden? Had Gabriel himself played a part in their vanishing? Federal agents arrived weeks later. They interviewed residents, seized documents, and issued gag orders, and then just as suddenly they left. The sheriff's files were sealed. Gabriel Thornfield sold his estate and vanished from Montana without a word. The people of Selkirk never got answers. The Thornfield mansion stood empty for decades, eventually falling into disrepair, but the questions never stopped. What happened to the Thornfield sisters who searched their rooms? And why was nothing taken? Why did the federal government get involved? And what did Gabriel know that made him disappear without ever speaking his daughters' names again? The mystery endures, but buried deep in archives, personal letters, and forgotten ledgers lies a truth more horrifying than anyone in 1899 could have imagined. And this is only the beginning. The morning of October 12, 1899 dawned over Selkirk, Montana, with a soft crimson light that filtered through the high mountain air, painting delicate patterns across windows and rooftops. It was a morning like any other, so it seemed. Gabriel Thornfield opened his general store at exactly 7 o'clock a.m., as he always did, his commitment to routine as unchanging as the town's reliance on him. Inside the family's grand Victorian home, the Thornfield sisters moved through their daily tasks with their usual grace, yet beneath the surface of their well-ordered lives subtle cracks had begun to show. Margaret, the eldest at 26, left the house at 8 o'clock a.m. with her lesson plan tucked in her satchel, heading for the one-room schoolhouse where she taught. Parents waiting outside noticed something was off. Margaret's usual warmth had been replaced by distant nods. She was preoccupied, her appearance slightly unkempt, as though she had dressed in haste. Even her eyes, usually bright with purpose, seemed dulled by something unspoken. At home, Catherine set up her easel in the backyard garden. She had been working for weeks on a landscape of the Bitterroot Mountains in full autumn bloom. Mrs. Henrietta Walsh, their observant neighbor, often watched her paint from across the street, but on this morning Catherine's movements were restless. She set her brush down, repeatedly pacing the garden or staring out toward the train station. She kept returning to the same small patch of canvas, painting it over again and again, as if trying to erase something. Only she could see. The twins, Elenina and Elizabeth, opened their seamstress shop promptly at 9 o'clock a.m., throwing themselves into their work on the mayor's daughter's elaborate wedding gown, but their usual laughter was gone. They spoke in hurried whispers, falling silent whenever a customer entered. One visitor, Mrs. Dorothy Fleming, noted how the girls fumbled their measurements and restarted tasks multiple times, an uncharacteristic lack of focus that she found deeply unsettling. Sarah spent her morning at the Methodist church rehearsing hymns for Sunday service. Reverend Atwood, a man with keen perception, noted her voice faltered more than once. When asked if she was ill, she replied vaguely that she felt a little off and brushed aside his concern. She refused an offer to summon the doctor, clearly concealing something deeper than a simple headache. Meanwhile, Grace, who had always been a pillar of precision, assisted her father in the general store, but she made basic arithmetic errors and seemed unusually quiet. Customers noticed how both Gabriel and his daughter kept glancing toward the street, their expressions taut with anticipation. Gabriel frequently checked his pocket watch, growing visibly anxious with each passing hour. Even young Rebecca, the spirited 14-year-old known for her joy and chatter, appeared subdued. While helping Mrs. Caldwell, the family housekeeper, prepare for the evening meal, she asked strange questions. Have you ever missed your family? When you were far away, can someone be happy even if they're separated from everyone they love? Mrs. Caldwell found the girl's tone oddly solemn, as though she were preparing herself for some painful inevitability. As the day progressed, these quiet disturbances escalated into something far more concerning. At approximately 3:00 p.m., Dr. Samuel Porter, returning from a house call, observed an eerie sight: all 7 sisters walking together along River Street, heading toward the train depot. Such a sight was unheard of. Their routines seldom overlapped in this way, and never in the mid-afternoon, but more disturbing than their presence together was their demeanor. The sisters walked in total silence. They moved with synchronized purpose, their faces pale, their eyes downcast. There was no warmth, no joy, only a mechanical precision that made the scene feel more like a funeral procession than a family stroll. When Dr. Porter called out to them, only Rebecca looked back, her eyes, usually bright and full of mischief, were wide with terror. Dr. Porter would later testify that he saw something in her gaze, a plea for help she couldn't voice aloud. That evening at 9:15 p.m., the last confirmed sighting of the sisters occurred. Timothy Fletcher, the telegraph clerk, was finishing his evening duties when he saw all 7 Thornfield daughters standing in a perfect line beneath the gaslight outside his office. They were dressed in their finest gowns, hair impeccably arranged, jewelry glinting in the soft amber light. Fletcher was struck not just by their formal appearance but by their demeanor. They stood rigid, facing the direction of the train station, unmoving and silent. Their posture suggested tension, as if bracing for something dreadful. Their faces, illuminated just enough to reveal their expressions, displayed no joy, only resignation and fear. They were not awaiting a celebration, they were preparing for something solemn, something unwanted. When Fletcher looked again, just 10 minutes later, they were gone. No coach had passed, no footsteps were heard. It was as if they had been swallowed by the night itself. What transpired after that hour remains shrouded in speculation and silence. Gabriel Thornfield, the only family member left behind, offered a statement that was both simple and suspiciously vague. He claimed to have retired to his study around 10:00 p.m. to read correspondence and update his business ledgers. Just another ordinary night, according to him. He stayed up for about 90 minutes, performed his usual house checks, said his nightly prayers in the family's private chapel, and went to bed at 11:30, but Mrs. Caldwell's testimony would later contradict the sense of normalcy Gabriel insisted upon. She had finished her chores and left the house precisely at 1000, as she always did, yet she described the atmosphere as different. Disturbingly so, the house was unnaturally quiet. No laughter, no footsteps, no voices drifting from the upper floors. Even the familiar creaks and groans of the large wooden house seemed subdued. Most telling was the absence of the sisters' nightly routine. Typically, they would gather in the kitchen around 10:00 p.m. for tea, small pastries, and shared conversation. They would lay out clothing, prepare their materials for the next day, and complete small chores that night. None of these rituals occurred. It was as if they had collectively abandoned thoughts of tomorrow. When dawn broke on October 13th, Mrs. Caldwell returned to find the house locked and silent. Her key turned smoothly in the door, and she stepped into what she would later describe as a tomb. The ticking of clocks, the rustling of curtains, all the tiny sounds that make a house feel alive, were gone. She moved from room to room, calling out names. No one answered. Then came the terrible realization: the sisters were gone. Their beds untouched, their gowns still hung at the foot of each bed, shoes placed neatly, rooms undisturbed. It was as if they had simply vanished from the world. The Thornfield mystery had officially begun. On the morning of October 13th, 1899, the Thornfield residence stood disturbingly silent. Mrs. Caldwell, the family's longtime housekeeper, had arrived just after sunrise, expecting the usual bustle of morning routines. Instead, she found the kitchen in pristine condition, every dish in place, no signs of breakfast preparation, and not a single pot disturbed from the night before. The surfaces gleamed with the polish she herself had applied the previous evening. There were no crumbs, no half-drunk cups of tea, no trace of life. It looked as though no one had set foot in the room since she had last locked up and gone home. Unease bloomed in her chest. Trying to quiet her growing sense of dread, she climbed the grand staircase leading to the second floor, where Margaret, Catherine, and the twins kept their bedrooms. The hallway was still uncomfortably so. None of the doors were ajar, which was unusual. Typically by this time she would hear the murmur of conversation, the soft creak of footsteps, or the rustle of skirts. But now there was nothing but an oppressive silence. She knocked gently on Margaret's door. When there was no response, she hesitated before slowly turning the handle. Inside, Margaret's room was immaculate, almost unsettlingly so. Her bed remained perfectly made, corners tucked with geometric precision, pillows aligned with symmetrical care, the coverlet stretched flat, and without a single wrinkle. Her nightgown hung from its usual hook by the window, untouched since the previous evening. On her dressing table, her brush and comb lay precisely as always, flanked by her small stack of reading books and the meticulously prepared lesson plans she had written the night before. Everything was in place. Yet everything was wrong. Mrs. Caldwell had cleaned this room hundreds of times. She knew its every corner and quirk, but now she noticed subtle inconsistencies. The items on the dressing table weren't quite aligned the way Margaret would have left them. A few of her books had been returned to the wrong order. The papers in her desk bore faint signs of having been handled, lifted, shuffled, and placed back without true understanding of their order. Someone had been here, someone who didn't belong. Catherine's room only deepened the mystery. Her bed, too, was untouched, the blankets tight, the pillows undisturbed, but the real shock came from the cleanliness. Catherine, ever the artist, typically left her room in a state of beautiful chaos, paintbrushes strewn about, unfinished canvases propped against walls, smudges of color across every surface. This morning, however, everything was unnaturally organized. Brushes were rinsed and dried, paints capped and sorted, every canvas stored as if by a stranger. It wasn't just clean, it was sterilized, arranged in a way that didn't fit Catherine's vibrant, messy soul. The twins' room, Elenina and Elizabeth, was more disturbing still. Their shared space had always reflected a mirrored harmony, every object duplicated in perfect symmetry, but now their order had been broken. Someone had clearly rifled through their belongings, drawers opened and shut again, hastily, contents examined and forced back without care to the untrained eye. It might have seemed undisturbed, but Mrs. Caldwell saw the truth. Someone had searched this room and tried poorly to mask their intrusion. Still, it didn't end there. Mrs. Caldwell ascended the narrow staircase to the third floor, heart-pounding breath shallow. Sarah, Grace, and Rebecca's rooms followed the same chilling pattern, beds untouched, nightgowns hanging neatly, possessions appearing in order yet subtly altered. Each room bore signs of a quiet, precise violation. Someone had been through every drawer, every box, every journal, every memory the girls had kept safe, but nothing had been stolen. The valuables were all in place, jewelry, money, cherished keepsakes. Whoever had searched the rooms hadn't come for wealth. When her scream finally tore loose, it echoed through the Thornfield house like a cry from the grave. It carried into the quiet streets of Selkirk and sent neighbors running. Mrs. Caldwell, hysterical, stumbled from the front door into the morning, chill tears streaking her face as she cried out that the girls were gone, that something impossible had happened, that the house was empty, silent, violated, but locked tight from the inside. Gabriel Thornfield, roused by the shouts and gathering crowd, refused at first to believe her. He sprinted through the house, calling for his daughters, praying for any sign, any voice, any movement, but each room delivered the same nightmare. 7 perfectly made beds, 7 untouched nightgowns, 7 rooms combed through with surgical precision by hands not their own. Gabriel collapsed into a chair, head in his hands, as the weight of it crashed down on him. His daughters were gone. Sheriff William Harding arrived minutes later, hat clutched tight in his hands. Nothing in his career could have prepared him for this. He had dealt with brawls, cattle theft, and drunken disputes, but this was something else. A locked house. 7 vanished women, no signs of forced entry or struggle. As he moved from room to room, Harding noted that every door and window was locked from the inside. The ground outside was soft from autumn rain, yet not a single footprint marred the soil around the house. It was as if no one had entered or exited the building. Still, it was clear someone had been inside. Harding's examination confirmed Mrs. Caldwell's account. Belongings disturbed, yet nothing missing. Clothing unfolded and refolded, jewelry examined but left. Personal letters shuffled and returned. It was a search, but for what he expanded the investigation over the next several days. Harding questioned nearly every resident of Selkirk. What emerged was a tapestry of strange events and whispers that hinted something dark had been building all summer. Witnesses spoke of well-dressed strangers arriving on evening trains, never staying long, never mingling, always conducting brief, urgent meetings with town elites before vanishing the next morning. They wore fine Eastern suits, carried monogrammed luggage, and avoided eye contact. The telegraph office added another layer. Timothy Fletcher, the night clerk, revealed that in the weeks before the disappearance, dozens of coded messages had been sent east of Chicago, New York, San Francisco, all indecipherable strings of letters and numbers. Most came from Gabriel Thornfield himself. Others were sent by the town's bank president and leading businessmen. It was clear now there had been a network of secret communication. Charles Whitman, president of the Selkirk Bank, initially stonewalled, but under pressure from Harding he revealed troubling patterns. In the 6 months before the sisters vanished, Gabriel had made several large withdrawals in gold. These coincided precisely with the stranger's visits. Even stranger, the Thornfield store showed minimal profits. Gabriel's wealth didn't add up. Deposits came regularly from shadowy investors out east, funneled through accounts unconnected to his business. By December, word had spread across the country. The story of the Thornfield sisters captivated a nation. Newspaper illustrations showed the girls with wide eyes and Victorian curls. Speculation raged. Were they kidnapped, murdered runaways, or was something darker at work? Federal authorities dispatched Inspector Marcus Reed from the Department of Justice, a seasoned investigator. Reed specialized in exposing criminal networks that stretched across state lines. He suspected this was no simple disappearance. His review of Gabriel Thornfield's records revealed dealings with a clandestine investment group, the Rocky Mountain Development Company. This organization, Reed would learn, was acquiring mineral rights throughout the Western Territories, often through coercion, bribery, or worse. Thornfield's wealth had been born not of honest trade but of backroom deals involving mining contracts, railway lines, and territorial appointments. Reed's investigation would lead far beyond Selkirk. What had begun as the vanishing of 7 sisters would uncover a vast tangled conspiracy, one rooted in the blood and soil of the American West. But that story and what truly happened to the Thornfield girls on the night of October 12th was only beginning to be unearthed. The Mountain Development Company proved particularly elusive to federal investigators. Operating behind a labyrinth of shell corporations, proxy agents, and subsidiary companies, it became nearly impossible to identify the true owners or trace the source of its seemingly limitless financial resources. What Agent Reed could confirm, however, was that the company had been strategically acquiring control over valuable natural resources across the West. Often, these acquisitions involved backdoor deals with local officials and influential citizens, who received generous payments in exchange for cooperation. Gabriel Thornfield's involvement with the organization appeared to have started shortly after his arrival in Selkirk. Records indicated that he received a sizable investment described as capital, which allowed him to expand his business well beyond what would have been possible through ordinary profits. In return, Gabriel provided the company with detailed intelligence on local mining operations, land ownership, and political currents, valuable data that shaped the organization's future investments. As the harsh Montana winter set in, the disappearance of the Thornfield sisters slowly shifted from active investigation to cold case. Selkirk itself began to change. Families unsettled by the investigation's implications and the attention it brought to their secluded town moved elsewhere. New residents arrived, unconnected to the tragedy, indifferent to its haunting legacy. Gabriel grew reclusive, rarely leaving his mansion except to visit the cemetery, where he had erected 7 pristine marble headstones despite the absence of any bodies. The Thornfield General Store, once the bustling heart of the community, was sold. The new owners had no knowledge of the circumstances that led Gabriel to withdraw from public life. They discovered many of his business records had been destroyed or mysteriously vanished, making it impossible to decipher the roots of his wealth. Evidence of the sisters' existence faded as well. Their belongings were stored away in the attic. Their contributions to Selkirk's artistic and literary life were gradually replaced by activities led by newcomers. Even their names slipped from memory as residents turned toward the future, choosing forgetfulness over an answerless tragedy. By spring 1901, a large portion of Selkirk's original community had moved on, taking with them whispered suspicions and unconfirmed theories. The town they left behind bore little resemblance to the closely knit community that existed before October 13, 1899. What remained was a more impersonal settlement, populated by individuals pursuing personal gain, uninterested in revisiting a past that threatened the illusion of prosperity. Selkirk's transformation mirrored a wider shift unfolding across the American West. As the 19th century waned, the promise of the frontier gave way to exploitation, corruption, and the ever-tightening grip of Eastern financial empires. Communities became resources, their citizens statistics, their fates determined by decisions made far away. Then, in spring 1922, a revelation in Chicago reopened the cold case and exposed a vast conspiracy. During the demolition of a derelict warehouse on the city's south side, workers uncovered a sealed chamber hidden behind false walls. Inside lay dozens of filing cabinets, crates of documents, and personal artifacts that told the story of a criminal empire. Among the discoveries were 7 small photographs. Each depicted one of the Thornfield sisters posed formally, as if taken in a professional studio. Disturbingly, these photographs seemed to have been taken after the sisters' disappearance. Margaret appeared in her 30s. Catherine wore elegant clothing indicating high status, though her eyes betrayed profound sorrow. The twins, Eleanor and Elizabeth, were photographed separately, their mirrored features now bearing subtle individual distinctions. Sarah, dressed in formal religious attire, looked solemn, her expression heavy with loss. Grace appeared to be in her mid-20s, wearing professional garb, yet her once bright gaze had dulled. Most haunting was Rebecca's image. Poised and beautiful, but her radiant joy was gone, replaced by something lifeless. Detective John Sullivan of the Chicago Police Department, investigating the warehouse as part of a larger inquiry into organized crime, immediately recognized the significance of the find. The files formed an archive detailing the operations of a highly organized criminal syndicate. Their focus: the systematic trafficking of young women under the guise of domestic placement services and social advancement opportunities. Meticulously kept records outlined a chilling business model. The syndicate preyed on vulnerable frontier families, offering dreams of upward mobility while masking their intentions with respectability. Through front-facing businesses, employment agencies, schools, charitable groups, they cultivated trust. Their representatives, well-dressed and armed with convincing documents, approached families with promises of opportunity. Once interest was established, the schemes deepened. Financial investments, partnership contracts, and binding commitments ensured families became dependent on the syndicate. They knew exactly what each family needed: money, prestige, or hope. Parents were convinced to send their daughters away for education or work, never suspecting the real intent. Detective Sullivan traced the syndicate's reach back to 1885, with ties in numerous frontier towns. Selkirk was just one of many. The records also confirmed what few dared suspect. Gabriel Thornfield had been involved far earlier than believed. Correspondence dating to 1893 linked his financial success to his cooperation with the organization. Gabriel had served as an informant and a coordinator. Initially, he offered names, vouched for recruiters, and passed along community intelligence. But over time, his role deepened. His influence, strategic position, and growing dependency on the syndicate's money made him indispensable. As scrutiny mounted and federal agents grew suspicious of Selkirk's strange prosperity, the syndicate decided Gabriel was a liability. They demanded he repay their investment with his daughters. Letters recovered in the Chicago files detailed his descent into desperation. Gabriel, caught between protecting his family and fearing the syndicate's retribution, pleaded for alternatives. He offered more money, proposed new recruits, even begged to relocate his family to escape the deal. Every offer was refused. The final letters revealed a man tormented by the unbearable. He feared ruin, financial collapse, criminal charges, threats to his life, and, worst of all, the destruction of everything he had built in Selkirk. He tried to delay, to negotiate, but the syndicate's patience had run out. What happened next, the final moments of the sisters in Selkirk, remained undocumented. But the photographs found in Chicago proved they hadn't died, at least not in 1899. The 7 sisters had been taken, not by ghosts or wilderness, but by a calculated and human evil. Their images survived, bearing witness to years of hidden suffering, stolen potential, and the failure of a father who had once believed he was doing what he must to save them all. With this evidence, the case was reopened. But justice, decades too late, would never undo the silence, the loss, or the legacy of betrayal that had begun in the quiet mountain town of Selkirk. The tragic revelation began with Gabriel Thornfield's final letters, dated only days before the mysterious disappearance of his 7 daughters. These letters unveiled a heartbroken father who had been coerced into a horrifying deal: the surrender of his daughters in exchange for the safety of his family. In his own words, Gabriel pleaded for their forgiveness, hoping they would one day understand his desperation. He had been assured by men of power that his daughters would be cared for, given affluent lives, and married into wealth. They would enjoy privileges and opportunities far beyond the rough life Montana could offer. But behind these promises lurked an unspeakable conspiracy. The horror embedded in Gabriel's final writings triggered a seismic reaction. Detective Sullivan, already deep in his investigation into the Thornfield case, had unearthed more than a family tragedy. The documents implicated a vast criminal enterprise that had thrived unchecked across the American West. This network, spanning from Montana to California, had trafficked hundreds of young women, often under the guise of marriage arrangements or employment. Gabriel's letters were only the beginning. The conspiracy had corrupted officials at every level: territorial marshals, judges, state lawmen, and even members of Congress. The scheme was disturbingly sophisticated. Bribes and intimidation kept authorities silent. Judges dismissed court petitions related to missing women. Sheriffs suppressed evidence and threatened grieving families into silence. Even worse, pillars of society, mayors, bankers, and industrialists, had facilitated the trafficking network while publicly championing family values and moral uprightness. They enriched themselves through the systematic destruction of families, using their influence to keep the truth buried. Over 300 women, aged between 14 and 26, had vanished between 1885 and 1910. They had been chosen not only for beauty but for their intelligence, family status, and perceived compliance. Some were taken by deception, others by coercion. The rise of the railroad had enabled fast, discreet transportation of victims. The isolation of frontier towns meant families had little means to coordinate rescue efforts. The promises of better lives were laced with lies that masked one of the darkest operations in American history. In Selkirk, the truth tore the town apart. Some demanded justice. Others feared what full exposure might bring. The Rocky Mountain Development Company, founded by Gabriel, had injected wealth into Selkirk. Local elites had benefited from this prosperity. Many of them had played roles in covering up the truth, receiving payments, silencing rumors, and obstructing investigations. Even the town's cemetery held secrets. The 7 marble headstones erected by Gabriel were discovered to encode the dates not of the sisters' deaths, but of their forced marriages. These markers were not memorials, but grim ledgers of enslavement. Gabriel, once seen as a broken father, was revealed to be complicit. He had accepted the deal, known the fates of his daughters, and opted for silence. His suicide note, found years later in Denver, exposed the unbearable guilt he carried. He admitted he had information that could have led to the rescue of his daughters, but had chosen self-preservation over justice. What made the investigation even more horrifying was the discovery that the organization responsible had not disappeared. By 1922, it had evolved into seemingly legitimate businesses, employment agencies, matchmaking services, and social clubs. But the underlying mechanisms remained. Vulnerable young women, now from immigrant families or urban poor, were still being targeted. The operation had simply adapted to the new century. In the spring of 1922, federal agents struck. Coordinated raids were launched across 12 states, involving more than 200 officers. They liberated dozens of women still in captivity and found records detailing the fates of hundreds of others. Among these were the comprehensive files on the Thornfield sisters. Margaret Thornfield had been sent to Cleveland and married to Harrison Pembroke, a wealthy steel magnate. She lived under the name Mary Patterson, imprisoned in luxury. Pembroke valued her intellect, but only as a trophy. She bore him 3 children but was forbidden from contacting her family. Her hidden journals were a goldmine, detailing years of abuse, surveillance, and forced isolation. These records helped agents locate additional victims. Catherine's fate was a cruel twist. Taken to Milwaukee, she was married to Augustus Richardson, an art collector who used her talents for profit. Her paintings, marketed under Richardson's name, were expressions of deep sorrow. Investigators found Catherine, now called Caroline Phillips, still in his mansion. She had survived by embedding secret messages and dates into her art. The twins, Eleanor and Elizabeth, had been deliberately separated to destroy their emotional bond. Eleanor was placed in St. Louis with Marcus Whitfield, a man who desired a frontier-born wife to manage his social affairs. She suffered a breakdown from the separation. Elizabeth, taken to Chicago, was married to Samuel Henderson, a banker. The trauma turned her from an energetic, confident woman into a shell of her former self. Both were told their twin had died. This calculated lie ensured their compliance and crushed their hope. Sarah's story was perhaps the most heartbreaking. Transported to Detroit, she was forced into marriage with Reverend Jonathan Morrison, a prominent religious figure with a dark private life. Morrison portrayed himself as a moral leader while abusing Sarah behind closed doors. She was made to serve as his assistant in public and subjected to relentless psychological and spiritual manipulation in private. As the investigation concluded, it became clear that the Thornfield tragedy had been part of a massive system of organized exploitation. Gabriel's surrender of his daughters was not an isolated incident but a symptom of a much larger rot. What began as a local mystery in Selkirk had become the catalyst for the exposure of one of the darkest criminal conspiracies in American history. And even after decades, the scars remained, not just in the lives of the Thornfield sisters, but across every community touched by this web of betrayal, power, and silence. The story continues. What became of the survivors? Could justice ever truly be served? Stay with us as we uncover the next chapter of this devastating saga. If this story chilled you to your core, share it with someone who appreciates the gravity of history's darkest corners. Hit the like button and subscribe for more true tales of horror, conspiracy, and human resilience. Minister Morrison had initially requested a wife with both musical talents and a deep religious background. Sarah was chosen specifically to fulfill that role. However, behind the public image of a loving husband and devout preacher, Morrison cruelly exploited Sarah's talents, forcing her to perform at his church and various social functions as though she were a prized possession rather than a partner. While the congregation admired her graceful performances, they were unaware of the torment she endured in private. Years of emotional abuse, physical control, and isolation slowly wore her down. Official records state she died of pneumonia in 1905, but investigators uncovered disturbing signs that her declining health had been the result of years of neglect and abuse. In her final days, Morrison withheld medical attention, seemingly seeing her death as a convenient opportunity to request a replacement from the trafficking network. Grace, the mathematically gifted sister, had been deemed particularly valuable by the organization's higher ranks. She was placed with Theodore Blackstone, a wealthy and secretive businessman in Chicago. Blackstone exploited Grace's intellect, using her talents to manage the intricate web of his financial empire. Trapped and monitored, she was cut off from the outside world, her brilliance reduced to a tool for orchestrating fraudulent investments and laundering money. Grace quietly resisted, embedding subtle errors in the ledgers in the hope authorities would uncover the truth. But her defiance did not go unnoticed. Her punishments became increasingly cruel until her spirit was shattered. In 1909, she died during childbirth, denied proper care and left to suffer alone, regarded by Blackstone as nothing more than a disposable asset. Rebecca, the youngest of the Thornfield sisters, endured perhaps the most prolonged suffering. She was too young for immediate placement and instead spent her childhood moving between hidden facilities run by the organization. These were not homes, but prisons, barely disguised warehouses for human cargo. Never staying in one place long enough to build trust or friendships, she grew up in a haze of fear and confusion. By the time she came of age, her frail health and psychological scars rendered her unfit for the kind of arrangements the organization sought. She died of tuberculosis in 1907 in a cold, forgotten facility meant for those deemed no longer profitable. The 1922 arrests sparked a media frenzy. The trials that followed exposed not just the horrors inflicted upon the Thornfield sisters, but also a wider network of exploitation stretching across the American frontier. Public outrage mounted as newspapers reported the depth of the trafficking ring's corruption, implicating politicians, judges, and businessmen. The central figure behind it all, Marcus Peton, was finally captured in a high-profile raid on his Chicago mansion. Peton's trial revealed a brilliant but morally bankrupt man, a sociopath who built a criminal empire with chilling precision. With no hint of remorse, he called his enterprise a service, supplying well-bred women to appreciative clients. His lack of empathy shocked even the most hardened observers. 17 of Peton's key associates were also convicted, but the web of corruption ensured many escaped justice. Witnesses vanished, evidence was destroyed, and several key players died under suspicious circumstances. Some powerful figures leveraged political alliances and wealth to avoid trial altogether, though the scandal permanently tarnished their reputations. For the surviving Thornfield sisters, the decision to come forward was harrowing. Authorities offered them the chance to testify and reclaim their identities, but doing so would mean destroying the new lives they'd painstakingly built in secrecy. Margaret, living under the name Mary Patterson at 49 years old, chose to testify. Her courage helped cement new protections for trafficking victims, and her articulate, dignified testimony moved the nation. She described not only the physical brutality of her captivity but also the deep psychological wounds that never fully healed. Catherine and Elizabeth declined to speak publicly. Catherine, now Caroline Phillips of Milwaukee, had children who knew nothing of her past. She feared that coming forward would devastate their lives. Elizabeth, still living as Ellen Pierce in St. Louis, remained emotionally fragile, having never recovered from her forced separation from her twin sister. Investigators respected their choice, recognizing that their silence was not weakness, but self-preservation. Selkirk itself would never be the same. Once proud of its place in frontier history, the town was now infamous. Many longtime residents left, unable to reconcile their community with its dark legacy. The once grand Thornfield mansion was demolished in 1925. In its place, a vacant lot remained, an empty space where a family's dream had been turned into a nightmare. At the local cemetery, the 7 individual headstones were replaced by a single stone monument, inscribed, "To the 7 sisters, victims of greed and betrayal, may truth finally set you free." Funded by contributions from across Montana, the memorial stood as a testament to the sisters' suffering and the determination of the public to ensure their story was never forgotten. The impact of the case rippled nationwide. It triggered sweeping reforms. Tighter regulation of employment and matrimonial agencies, improved coordination between state law enforcement, and mandatory reporting procedures for missing persons. Most critically, the Thornfield tragedy laid bare how economic hardship and social isolation made frontier families easy prey for traffickers. Peton's organization had thrived not just through criminal cunning, but because American society failed to protect its most vulnerable. The case also prompted reflection on the social pressures young women faced in isolated communities. Promised a better future, they were delivered into servitude. The Thornfield case made clear that trafficking was not just an urban or foreign issue. It was rooted in America's own heartland, often hiding behind the illusion of opportunity. For decades after, law enforcement agencies studied the case to understand how trafficking networks operated. The sisters' story became a foundation for reforms aimed at both prevention and support for victims. Their suffering, though immense, forced a reckoning that may have saved countless others. Gabriel Thornfield's pursuit of the American dream, sending his daughters into what he believed were secure futures, had unintentionally delivered them into captivity. His ambition, though well-intentioned, exposed a fatal flaw in a society that prioritized progress over protection. The sisters became casualties of a system that commodified innocence and ignored cries for help. Yet even within that tragedy, there was resilience. Margaret's voice in court carried the power of truth. Her sacrifice ensured that others might not suffer in silence. The legacy of the Thornfield sisters is not just one of sorrow, but of resistance, courage, and eventual justice. Their story is a warning and a remembrance that the pursuit of prosperity must never come at the cost of humanity, that protecting the vulnerable is the true mark of a civilized society. But do you believe this was the whole truth? Or do secrets still lie buried beneath the surface, hidden in forgotten files and unmarked graves across the American frontier? Leave your thoughts below. Share your theories. If you were moved by this story and want to uncover more chilling truths from America's dark past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and join us as we explore another haunting chapter of history.